Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Pirate of Her Own by Kinley Macgregor, narrated by Will Thorne. Savannah Dispatch. The Legend of the Seawolf, S.S. James, Savannah, Georgia, 1793. I have been told, by sources most reliable, of an incredible hero, of a man so cunning, so courageous that none can touch his skill. He is as dark as the night, his ship as black as a raven's wing. Like a phantom wind, he comes upon unsuspecting British ships and reclaims that which those wretched British have taken from us. He is all things American, proud and true, like Nathan Hale, who gave his life so that the rest of us could live free. Holding true to his mission, begun during our war for independence, he returns our impressed men back home to their loving families. But who is this man, our hero? Some say he was once a pirate prince who decided to make good his life. Some say he was a destitute orphan left to brave the harsh realities of life alone. Others have told me that he was once a British sailor who knows firsthand the cruelties of the British Navy. One thing I know for certain. This man is like no other. He answered America's call to arms. He is our legend, the savior of our seas. But guard your heart well, ladies, for I am also told that he is dashing and handsome, a man well used to feminine company. Like Lancelot of old, he has left behind numerous ladies of Shalott who mourn for his loss. For his is a mission of passion far greater than the lure of a woman's arms. The sea wolf can never be tamed. He will never be leashed. He is as unpredictable as the sea, and every bit as dangerous. So look twice at those sails in the distance. Do they belong to some passing merchant or a navy ship, or are they the white sails of Triton's revenge? Look again, and pray God, you foes of America, that those sails come no closer, lest you find out. Prologue. Cannon fire roared as waves of thick grey smoke billowed across the deck of Triton's Revenge. Even after almost an hour of battle, Morgan Drake was still amazed that the English frigate had actually tried to defend itself from him. It had been a long time since anyone dared such an affront. Most captains knew his flag on sight, and after firing a round or two of initial rebuttal, they docilely submitted to his plunder. But not the Molly Doone. For some reason her captain had taken on a fool's crusade. What could the ship possibly carry that would make her captain so willing to risk the lives of all his crew? He would know soon enough. Another blast sounded. Morgan barely had time to duck before a cannonball whizzed past, only to land harmlessly off the starboard prow. He sucked his breath in sharply between his teeth. A few more feet and he would have been searching the waves for his head. "A captain's share to the crew who disables the mainmast!" Morgan shouted to his gunners. He was bored with this game, and it was time to end it. 8 of the cannons on the main deck of his ship were pushed forward, while 4 more were reloaded. He could feel the deck beneath his feet jar as the cannons were pulled back and forth by their crews. The cotton fuses hissed just before the cannons fired, almost in unison. After pulling back the cannons, his gun crews dumped water over the long iron barrels to cool them off before they repeated the loading process. Morgan smiled at their efficiency, at the symphony of their movements. How he loved this, every bleeding part of it. His ears ringing from the fight, Morgan watched his men fire another volley at their target. A few seconds later, wood began splitting as rigging fell from the Molly Doone. The mainmast made a tidal splash in the ocean, and his crew raised a cacophonous bellow of victory. The pungent smell of sulphur circled around him and stung his eyes. For hours he and his crew had been pursuing the English frigate Molly Doone, and at long last the chase had ended. With one final shot, the Revenge had crippled her prey. "Bring her about, Mr. Pitcairn," Morgan shouted to his quartermaster. "The Molly Doone is listing to port." "Aye, aye, Captain," Barney Pitcairn responded, whirling the wheel. The Revenge cut a smooth course through the waves until it drew broadside with the Molly Doone. "Stand ready to defend," Morgan called to the 12 sharpshooters who were positioned in the rigging as a precaution against whatever other surprises might be lurking aboard the Molly Doone. "Fire upon my orders." Their answer to his words came as each man trained his sights on the enemy vessel. To safeguard his identity, Morgan placed his mask over his face. On the main deck of his ship, 16 members of his crew drew swords and pistols as they made ready to board the smoking frigate. Grappling hooks whistled through the air as 4 men whirled and tossed them to catch the thick oaken boards of the Molly Doon's sides and haul the lumbering ship nearer. He found it surprising that none of the English sailors had bothered to arm themselves, especially given the fact that they had fought him so ferociously just moments before. Instead, the English stared at him as if they were seeing a terrifying phantom. Even their captain, dressed in the dark blue coat, white breeches and powdered wig of the Royal Navy, did nothing more than open and close his mouth like a gaping fish. As they drew close enough for him to see the individual faces, Morgan could pick out the English sailors from the Americans who had been impressed into service. The American sailors' eyes burned with great relief, while their British counterparts shook visibly with fear of his retribution. Barney gave a raspy laugh.
"Look at there, Captain. They finally got the white flag."
"Aye, and from the look of the English captain, it's not from his drawers,"
Kit added. Morgan laughed at his boatswain. For a youth barely old enough to shave, Kit had seen more than his share of blood and battle, and soiled English breeches.
"Bring him aboard, boys,"
Barney shouted to the small group of their men who were pulling out boarding planks.
"We claim America's riches from them thieving Brits."
In only a few minutes, his crew separated the Americans from their slavers and sent the newly freed men across the small makeshift gangplank to the safe deck of the Revenge. His crew was well accustomed to such skirmishes, and Morgan knew it wouldn't take his men long to ferret out whatever stolen American goods might be hidden aboard the fallen ship. Once they'd reclaimed all that property, they would head home for a well-deserved liberty. Barney shouted orders to 2 of the men to help lift a crate of American spice over the last plank. Morgan smiled at the old man's efficiency. At 62, Barney looked like a withered-up piece of driftwood, but his small stature and bald pate hid the fact he was one of the finest quartermasters to ever sail the seas.
"Cap'n,"
one of the men called as he helped set the crate on the deck,
"this be too heavy for spice."
Curious, Morgan removed his long dagger from his belt and pried loose a board. He searched through shredded pieces of paper until his hand brushed against something smooth and hard. Seizing it, he pulled out a piece of raw gold. Morgan laughed. No wonder the British had risked their lives. Even though he would have to give the new American government a share of the bounty, there would be plenty of gold left to make all of his crew happy men.
"What be the fate of the Molly Doon, Cap'n?"
Barney asked as soon as the last crate was brought over. Morgan glanced about the terrified faces of the Brits and pondered the answer. None of his crew had been seriously hurt, and with the exception of a few pieces of split rigging and nicks in the railing, his ship stood sound, and they had taken a king's ransom in gold. Today he was feeling merciful. "Raise all the jib and mizzen sails," he told Barney. "That should keep them occupied for a while and eliminate any thought they might have of renewing our fight."
"Nay,"
the English captain begged in a raspy whine.
"that shall leave us prey for pirates."
Anger creased Morgan's brow and he curled his lip at the man. "Well, then you should be grateful. My experience with pirates is that they treat their captives much better than the English Navy treats its impressed sailors." Kit laughed at his words.
"Aye now, Captain, don't you think that he'd make a fine cabin boy for some pirate prince?"
Barney slapped the youth on the back.
"Better a swabber, but with those pudgy fists and fat bottom, he could cover the decks in a matter of minutes."
Morgan shook his head at their banter. "Raise the sails and chart a course for home," he called to Barney. "I think our guests are more than ready to weigh anchor on solid ground." His words brought a cheer from the newly freed Americans as his crew rushed to carry out his orders. No sooner had they drifted past the Molly Doon than one of the American sailors came forward. Gratitude burned brightly in the man's brown eyes as he pulled his ragged English scarf from his head and stopped in front of Morgan.
"I don't know how to thank you, Captain. We've all prayed many a night that one day Triton's revenge would cross our paths and make us free."
Morgan remembered a time when he, too, had whispered such desperate prayers, only his prayers had gone unanswered until he'd been forced to take matters into his own hands. He'd learned early in life that he could depend on no one but himself. "I'm glad that I had the chance to free you."
"Aye,"
another sailor said, moving up alongside the first.
"You're just like the story said, proud and true."
Morgan went cold at the words. "What story?" he asked.
"Why, this one here that I picked up from a colonial ship last month,"
the man said while he fished inside his pocket. After a moment, he produced a crumpled scrap piece of parchment and handed it to Morgan. As Morgan scanned the writing, anger throbbed through every fibre of his body. God's blood! Someone had found out who he was. "Mr. Pitcairn!" he shouted, gaining Barney's attention. "Shift course and head us for Savannah." "Savannah, Captain?" "Aye, I've got fish to fry." Chapter 1.
Well, what do you think?
Douglas Adams smiled at the hopeful enthusiasm on Serenity James's face. She looked much as she had the very first time he'd met her almost 20 years ago. Only then she'd been covered in dirt, her dress and stockings torn, while she clutched a shiny apple to her tiny 5-year-old chest, an apple she climbed high into a tree to claim. Though her face no longer bore the childhood cherub quality he'd first grown to love, it still held that sparkling romanticism that had prompted her to climb the tree and proclaim herself Helen of Troy clutching the golden apple of Venus. "I think it's your best story yet," he said at last, deciding he had kept her long enough in suspense. His reward was an even brighter smile, one that lit her face and made her eyes glow like indigo fire. Though far from a stunning beauty, Serenity held her own special quality that set her apart from the other women her age. Even a married man of Douglas's advanced years couldn't quite deny her unique charms or appeal. Serenity leaned over his desk and looked upside down at the sheets of paper he held.
You don't think the ending is overly dramatic, do you?
She looked up to meet his gaze.
I tried not to make it too dramatic, but you know how I can get sometimes when I—
"Nay, I don't think so," he said with a smile, cutting her off. That was one thing about Serenity. Any time she became nervous or excited, she tended to babble off whatever was on her mind. If one didn't take charge, then one could become blindsided by her chatter. "I think the idea of a far-reaching conspiracy was quite clever." Her delight over his praise died, and she pulled her spectacles from the bridge of her nose. In her familiar nervous habit, she toyed with the left earpiece of the spectacles and drew her brows together into a deep frown.
"D'you think Father will like it?"
An ache seized Douglas's heart. How she longed to please her irreconcilable father, but after working for the man these last 20 years, Douglas had come to the realization that nothing would ever please Benjamin James. "I can't see why he'd refuse to publish it." She smiled half-heartedly. All too well she knew why her father might refuse the story, why he continued to refuse his daughter.
"How I wish I'd been born a man,"
she said, with the same longing Douglas had heard countless times.
"Then I could report real news like you, Father, and Jonathan. I could go down to the docks and interview witnesses, go into taverns and—"
She shook her head, sighed, and pushed herself away from his desk.
"I know you're tired of hearing me say that."
She left his side to walk toward her mahogany desk, the top of which was piled high with the manuscripts she dutifully edited for them. The hem of her plain, practical black dress rustled slightly with her steps as she paced their tiny work area. She stopped and looked wistfully out the large bay windows, down the busy street that was filled with sailors, fishmongers, filthy children, and businessmen rushing to and fro from the docks. How she yearned for things they both knew she could never do. If it were within his power, Douglas thought, he would gladly give her the autonomy she craved. Unfortunately, all he could offer was a sympathetic ear and some encouragement. "Don't give up hope, Miss Serenity," he offered, hoping to cheer her. "One day, adventure will come bounding through that very door, and you'll—"
"Run for cover,"
she said with a sigh. Turning to face him, Serenity replaced her spectacles and squared her shoulders into the no-nonsense stance that she wore like a protective mantle.
"We both know what a milch cow I am," she said. "I shall never be a bold woman who flouts societal rules like my idol Lady Mary. I'm afraid I'm far too practical for that."
Crossing the room, Serenity took the pages from his hands and flipped through them.
"But at least I can pretend."
The door to their small printing shop opened, ushering in a crisp autumn breeze that rustled pages of the journals lining the tops of tables set around the room. Douglas straightened in his chair as his employer, Benjamin James, came into the office, wearing the stern frown that had etched permanent lines in his weathered features. "Good afternoon, sir," Douglas said quietly. Benjamin responded with a cool harumph.
"How did it go, Father?"
Serenity asked. "They wouldn't tell me anything," he snapped. I'll send Jonathan down there later today. Mayhap your brother can get them to open up. Great Caesar knows he seems to do better than me most of the time, wastrel mixnut that he is."
His cold blue eyes focused on the pages in her hands, and he lifted one white bushy brow that made his scowl appear even more ominous. Douglas sank lower in his chair, wishing he could vanish into the very floor, while Serenity met her father's stare unflinchingly. Douglas had never understood Serenity's immunity to her father's black moods. If only he could learn her secret.
"What's that?" Benjamin snapped. "Another one of your infernal stories?"
"Yes, I just finished it this—"
"I don't know why you bother,"
he grumbled, taking the pages from her and crinkling them. Douglas clenched his teeth at the visible cringe in Serenity's shoulders. How could her father treat her hard work so callously? No, he corrected himself. It wasn't so much all the work she put into her stories. It was her soul. Those were her dreams she wrote down, dreams they both knew would never come true. But he could never tell her that. She heard it enough from her splenetic father. Douglas would never be so cruel as to remind her that childhood dreams should be left behind along with dolls and frilly smock dresses. Reality was just too harsh sometimes to face without them. Shaking his head, Benjamin waved the pages under her nose.
"Blasted waste of time for a girl your age. On the shelf, that's what you are. You ought to have callers. I should have a grandson or two by now. But no, what do I get? One daughter who runs off in the middle of the night, another daughter who thinks she's some sort of solicitor, and a son who can't be trusted to tie his own stock."
He ran his gaze over her, his eyes flaming with anger.
"And if they aren't enough to drive me mad, then what little sanity I have left is jeopardized by a daughter who thinks she's Lady Mary Wortley Montague."
He rolled his eyes heavenward and implored her mother's spirit with a litany Serenity had long ago memorized.
"Why did you leave me with them, Abigail? She, like the rest of her wayward siblings, needs your gentling influence, not mine."
He shook his head again and dropped his gaze back to his daughter.
"Never would listen to me."
His tirade finished, he made his way into the back of the shop to his desk, where he tossed her pages down upon the other pieces that littered his workspace. Serenity crossed her arms over her chest and offered Douglas an encouraging smile. Still, he noted the flush of embarrassment staining her cheeks.
"You'll publish it, Miss Serenity,"
Douglas offered again, and in an effort to restore their usual camaraderie, he added the same phrase that had become their own private jest.
"And one day your adventure shall come."
Her smile turned genuine, whimsical. She gave a light laugh that made him smile in return.
"Just so long as it comes with wavy ebony hair, flashing eyes of danger, and dressed like a pirate."
Douglas laughed, glad to see her father hadn't dampened her spirit.
"Aye, your pirate shall come on a rainy day like this, with the wind whipping his hair and his hat askew."
2 days later, Serenity watched once more as the world walked by outside the windows of her father's printing office.
24 years old today,
she breathed to the dozing calico cat sitting in her lap as she reshuffled the pages she was proofreading.
And I'm no closer to being the writer I wanted to be than when I turned 5.
"Writer? Bah!"
Her father's impatient voice thundered across the office, making her jump. Though they were alone in the office, she had been sure he was far enough away not to hear her musings. Too bad he drifted closer while she'd been reading. She should have looked up before she spoke her thoughts aloud.
"You should be minding my grandchildren,"
he continued to rail as he came to rest before her desk.
"That's what would make you happy, not sitting here doing men's work."
He lifted her right hand up to where she could see the ink stains that covered her fingertips and nails.
"Look at that mess. Why, I should never have published any of your stories or even let you come near this office."
He dropped her hand and scowled.
"All I've done is encourage you to be willful and stubborn."
Serenity refused to cower before her father, or let him get the last word about this personal matter that they both knew rubbed her raw.
"If marriage be such a blessed state, how comes it there are so few happy marriages?"
Her father glared indignation at her and slammed his hand down on the mahogany desk. The loud thump echoed in the room, and several papers fluttered from the force of the gesture. Her cat, Pris, jerked her head up, looked at Benjamin James, then lay back in Serenity's lap.
"Don't you be quoting any of that social reform rhetoric to me, girl. Lady Mary—"
"'Tis Mary Astle, father."
"I don't care if it's the Virgin Mary. I'll have no more of this disobedience from you. By God, I'll find you a husband by the end of this week if it kills me." Serenity bit her lip to stifle the words that leapt into her mouth. He'd never find a husband for her. They both knew that. Even with the modest fortune her father had, he would be hard-pressed to find a man who'd be willing to wed what the town biddies had dubbed that poor James girl. The familiar voices of the town matrons filled her head.
That girl should have been given the stick years ago, before it was too late for her father to find her a suitable husband, while man would suffer through one of her lectures. That poor James girl, too old, too drab, and far too opinionated.
The type of man her father thought respectable would never agree to marriage with one such as she. No, those men sought younger brides, girls with underdeveloped minds who were just waiting for a man to fill them with whatever nonsense he deemed suitable. She was cut from a different mold. Serenity sighed in sudden regret, not of being different, nay, she would never regret that, but what ached inside her was her inability to agree with her father's wants and desires where she was concerned. When had they become so different? There had been a time once when she and her father had been close, inseparable, a time when he had agreed with her about such matters as women taking on an important role in the emerging American utopia, of women being well educated. Her mother's death had changed all that. Still, he did support her writing in his own way. In spite of his complaints and harsh remarks, he did publish her stories, and those who refused often found their way into the dispatch anyway. And though it irked him when she published a story behind his back, he had yet to banish her from the office for it. Maybe it was foolish of her, but she liked to think that in some way he was proud of her, and that was why he allowed her to continue working for him. "Here," he snapped, laying more papers on the desk before her. His brow drawn into a stern frown, he crossed the room to the coat tree to retrieve his hat and overcoat. "I need those edited by the end of the week."
"Yes, father,"
she said quietly, as she watched him shrug on his overcoat. He gave her one last imperious scowl before reaching for the brass doorknob. Rubbing her eyes beneath her spectacles, Serenity nudged her cat from her lap and sat forward. "Get rid of that blasted stray," he snapped, an instant before he slammed the door shut behind him and braved the pouring rain. Pris lifted her nose in the air and gave an indignant sniff as if she'd understood his order.
"It's all right, girl," Serenity said. "You know I'll never get rid of you."
With a haughty flick of her tail, Pris headed off toward the back of the shop. Suddenly the sharp scent of ink stung Serenity's nostrils, distracting from her father's words. Serenity froze. Surely she hadn't smudged ink against her cheek or eye again. Not today of all days, not with a party that very evening. It had taken a month for the last smudge to wear off her skin. Mr. Jones, the baker, had thought it a black eye and had given her father dirty looks for weeks. She laughed at the thought. Though gruff, her father would never hurt her, at least not physically, though there were times when his caustic remarks did sting as much as a blow. If only she could find some way to prove herself to him, to prove to everyone that Serenity James was just as capable a writer as her brother.
"Oh, Pris," she said to her cat, "what I wouldn't give to have a great lead, to find the one story that would also rivet the entire country."
She sighed in sudden defeat as she watched her cat sit in the corner and clean her right paw.
Who am I kidding?
Wiping a towel soaked with turpentine against her cheek, Serenity swept a glance to the work surrounding her.
"Dreary. My whole life is nothing but dreary drudgery. I can edit men's articles, but no one trusts me to write them."
She would probably live and die right here in this office, shuffling paper, reading exciting stories about exciting people, while the only excitement she could look forward to was a few fireworks on the docks during celebrations and holidays. And if she were really lucky, she thought sarcastically, Charlie Sims might join her. She shivered at the very thought of the gangly coppersmith who could never take a hint that she had no interest in him. He was nice enough, but he had the type of wandering hands that kept her hopping, and breath that would shame a frightened polecat. Sighing, she set her towel down on the desk and gazed longingly out the bay window covered with droplets of rain, toward the docks filled with people who'd lived incredible lives, people who'd seen incredible sights. Oh, if she only had a tiny bit of the courage her idol Lady Mary Wortley Montague possessed. To marry for love and travel the world, learning languages, visiting harems. What she wouldn't give to be swept away from her endless, monotonous cycle of home and work, to find a dashing, dark pirate who would come and spirit her away to far adventures the likes of which she could barely conceive. Serenity laughed at her immorality. Her father would have an apoplexy if he even suspected she held such a notion.
If only it could really happen.
Shaking her head at her foolishness, she laughed.
Well, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, then we'd all have a Merry Christmas.
The little bell above the door chimed. Her cheeks warmed at being caught in the midst of her indecent thoughts. Serenity straightened up in her chair.
Did you forget some?
Her voice trailed off as she looked up and saw the black-garbed mountain entering her office. The man had his head bent to shield his face from the storm. With the water dripping, he swept into the office and in one graceful movement removed his hat from his head and threw back a corner of his black cape. By heaven, it was certainly not her father. Nay, this man was her dream pirate come to life, a man of unspeakable handsomeness, a man of broad, corded muscles that rippled beneath the damp cream waistcoat and white shirt. His stock had come untied and dangled loosely about his wet shirt front, exposing a sleek neck, a sensuous neck that appealed to a part of her she'd never met before, a part of her that wanted to run her fingers over his exposed flesh to see what it felt like.
By heaven,
her mind repeated. Hair as black as pitch was pulled back into a queue, and he possessed a face that was neither pretty nor fair, but one that was decidedly masculine. Granite, that was the only word for his sharp, aristocratic features. Aye, they looked as if they'd been carved especially for him, and right now those features were rigidly stern, his dark eyes terrifying in their heated intensity. Obviously unaware of his disheveled condition, he had the look of a man who'd ridden hard and with a purpose. Shaking the water from his hat, he stepped forward. Serenity finally gathered enough wit to close her gaping mouth and swallow hard.
"May I help you?"
she asked, her voice trembling at the incredibly fierce sight he posed. "Aye," he said, his stare intensifying. "I'm looking for a Mr. S.S. James." The butterflies in her stomach multiplied. Whatever could he want with her? Well, she certainly knew what she would want him to want with her. Even with her eyes wide open, she could imagine him leaning close to her, feel his breath prickling her neck as he whispered poetry in her ear.
"Get a hold of yourself."
Blinking to banish the image, she forced herself to remain as calm as was possible when one confronted a come-to-life dream.
"That would be me. Serenity James. How may I help you?"
Surprise flickered in the magnificent hazel depths of his eyes a moment before they hardened. Serenity had the impression that it wasn't often something took this man by surprise, and that thought gave her an unexpected feeling of delight. He dropped a portion of the Savannah Dispatch down on her desk. "Then tell me of this story you wrote." She glanced down at the scrap piece of paper and realized it was the past month's edition where she'd published the Seawolf article without her father's approval. Heaven above, would this piece ever cease haunting her? Her father had only stopped railing over it yesterday. Even the reserved Douglas had a few choice things to say about it. Now this man wanted to start where they'd left off. What was it about that one article that made every man want to strangle her? Greatly miffed, she returned his stare evenly.
"What do you wish to know of it?"
"I want to know everything you know about the Seawolf and his ship, Triton's Revenge." In spite of her anger, her lips curled into a smile as she recalled the romantic buccaneer who preyed solely on British ships.
"Oh, isn't it the most incredible story you've ever heard?"
He arched a brow. Though her common sense told her to stop, as usual when she talked about one of her stories, she couldn't keep her tongue still, especially not about this particular story of a true American hero whom she worshipped.
"The minute I heard of him and his bravery, I just couldn't keep myself from becoming entranced. The Seawolf is the most courageous hero to ever roam the billowing waves. Kind but fierce, he protects those who can't protect themselves. And his crew, don't you just love the motley bunch who sail with him?"
His look turned murderous. A sudden wave of fear crept along her spine, and she had the distinct feeling that he didn't care for her writing one little iota.
"Why is this so important to you?"
she asked. "I think you know well enough why." Confused, she shook her head. Why would he assume such?
"No, I can't say that I do."
"What do you take me for, a fool?"
"Certainly not,"
she answered. Indeed, she took him for a most marvelous specimen of male physiology. He reminded her much of the hero she had dreamed of for the Seawolf. Aye, The sea-wolf would have had that same fiercely stubborn jaw and those dangerous eyes that flashed like burnt cinnamon. You talk about sources in your article. Who...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?